What happens when America's most beloved former First Lady sits down for what should be a friendly late-night chat, only to find herself in the most intense exchange ever captured on television? The tension in Studio 57 became so thick you could cut it with a knife, and what started as pleasantries quickly spiraled into something nobody in that audience was prepared for. Before we get into this absolutely wild exchange, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me whose side you're on after watching this unfold. Trust me, you're going to have opinions. The Late Show had promoted this appearance for weeks. Michelle Obama, promoting her latest initiative focused on civic engagement and youth empowerment, was supposed to be the perfect guest for a Monday night episode. Stephen Colbert seemed like the ideal host to have a thoughtful conversation with someone of her stature and experience. The audience filed in with high expectations, cameras rolled, and the band played as Michelle walked onto the stage. The first few minutes went exactly as everyone expected. They discussed her new program, the importance of getting young people involved in their communities, and the state of education in America. Michelle spoke with passion about the work she had been doing, and Stephen nodded along, occasionally interjecting with a joke or a thoughtful follow-up question. Everything seemed perfectly choreographed for another successful late-night interview. But then Stephen shifted gears. His tone changed, becoming more probing, more journalist than entertainer. He leaned forward and asked Michelle about her thoughts on the current political landscape, specifically about the divisiveness that seemed to be tearing the country apart. Michelle responded with her usual measured approach, talking about the need for unity, for people to see past their differences, and for leadership that brings people together rather than driving them apart. Stephen listened, but there was something different in his expression. He pressed further, bringing up specific incidents, specific moments where political figures had made controversial statements, and asked whether she thought enough was being done to call out that behavior. Michelle's expression tightened slightly. She responded by saying that she believed in focusing on solutions rather than dwelling on problems, that pointing fingers had never been her style, and that real change came from action, not just criticism. The audience could sense something shifting. Stephen was not backing down. He brought up her time in the White House, asked about decisions that had been made, policies that had been implemented, and whether looking back she felt they had done enough to address the underlying issues that were now manifesting across the country. Michelle's posture changed. She sat up straighter, and her voice took on a firmer edge. She told Stephen that it was easy to sit back and critique from a position of hindsight, that governing a country of hundreds of millions of people with vastly different needs and perspectives was infinitely more complex than making jokes about it on television. The audience gasped audibly. Stephen's eyebrows shot up, but he recovered quickly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He acknowledged her point but countered by saying that comedy and commentary served an important function in democracy, that holding leaders accountable, even former leaders, was not just acceptable but necessary. Michelle did not hesitate. She said that accountability was one thing, but oversimplification was another. She spoke about how media personalities often reduced complicated issues to punchlines, how they created narratives that fit their show's format rather than reflecting reality, and how that contributed to the very divisiveness they claimed to oppose. Stephen leaned back, clearly not expecting this level of pushback. The studio had gone remarkably quiet. Stephen tried to lighten the mood with a joke about how he was just a comedian with a show, not a policymaker, so maybe she should cut him some slack. But Michelle was not having it. She looked him directly in the eye and said that influence came with responsibility, and whether he liked it or not, his show reached millions of people every night and shaped how they thought about important issues. She said that when someone had that kind of platform, they could not hide behind the excuse of just being a comedian when it was convenient. The tension was palpable. Stephen's producer could be seen off-camera making gestures, likely signaling for a commercial break, but Stephen waved them off. He was fully engaged now. He asked Michelle whether she was suggesting that comedians and commentators should not criticize political figures at all, whether she thought they should just remain silent when they saw things they disagreed with. Michelle shook her head and clarified that she was not saying that at all. She said criticism was essential, but it needed to be informed, it needed to be fair, and it needed to acknowledge complexity rather than reducing everything to heroes and villains. She pointed out that during their time in the White House, they had faced relentless criticism from all sides, much of it unfair, much of it based on incomplete information or outright lies. And while they had accepted that as part of the job, it did not mean that kind of approach was helpful or productive. Stephen countered by bringing up specific examples from her husband's presidency, moments that had been controversial, decisions that had sparked intense debate. He asked her directly how she could talk about unfair criticism when there had been legitimate concerns raised about certain policies and actions. Michelle's jaw tightened, visibly. She took a breath before responding, and when she spoke, her words were measured, but carried an unmistakable intensity. She said that legitimate concerns and bad faith attacks were not the same thing, and anyone who had paid attention knew the difference. She talked about how they had faced an unprecedented level of obstruction, how they had been questioned and doubted in ways that previous administrations had not, and how, despite all of that, they had worked tirelessly to do right by the American people. She said that coming on shows like this, she had expected a conversation, not an interrogation, especially from someone she had considered an ally. That word hung in the air, ally. Stephen's expression shifted slightly, and for a moment it seemed like he might back off, but he did not. Instead, he said that being an ally did not mean being uncritical, that real friendship, real respect, meant being willing to have difficult conversations rather than just offering empty praise. He said that he had tremendous respect for everything she and her husband had accomplished, but that respect did not mean he would not ask tough questions or point out areas where he disagreed. Michelle nodded slowly, acknowledging his point, but her expression remained serious. She said that was fair, but then asked him whether he applied that same standard equally, whether he interrogated all his guests with the same intensity, or whether certain people got softballs while others got prosecuted. The audience collectively held their breath. This was no longer a typical late-night interview. This had become something else entirely. Stephen paused before answering, clearly choosing his words carefully. He admitted that not all interviews were the same, that the nature of the conversation depended on who was sitting across from him and what was relevant to discuss. But he insisted that he did not play favorites, that he asked the questions he thought were important regardless of who might be uncomfortable with them. Michelle listened, her expression unreadable, and when he finished, she asked him point blank whether he thought this interview would have gone the same way if someone else had been sitting in her chair. The question hung between them, loaded with implication. Stephen started to respond, then stopped himself. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable for everyone watching. Finally, he said that he believed he would have asked similar questions of anyone in her position, anyone who had been in the White House and who was now speaking publicly about the state of the country. But even as he said it, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. Michelle pressed the point. She said that she had been on countless talk shows, had done hundreds of interviews, and there was something different about the way certain hosts approached her, a particular kind of scrutiny that felt personal in ways that went beyond politics or policy. She said she was not imagining it, and she was tired of pretending it did not exist just to make everyone else comfortable. The audience erupted in applause, some people standing, clearly resonating with what she was saying. Stephen said he understood her frustration, that he could not speak to how other interviewers approached her, but that in this specific conversation, his questions came from a place of genuine interest in getting real answers rather than rehearsed talking points. Michelle responded immediately, her voice rising slightly. She said that what he called rehearsed talking points she called carefully considered positions developed over years of actual experience in the arena, not from the sidelines. She said it was exhausting to constantly have to defend and explain and justify when so much of what they had done spoke for itself. Stephen acknowledged that they had achieved significant things during their time in office. But then he circled back, asking whether those accomplishments meant they should be beyond criticism, whether success in some areas excused failures in others. Michelle leaned forward, her hands gesturing emphatically. She said that was not what she was saying at all, that of course they were not perfect, but that did not mean every criticism was valid, or that she had to accept being held to a different standard than everyone else. The energy in the studio had become electric. Stephen tried to interject, but Michelle was not finished. She said that the real issue was not whether she could handle criticism, because obviously she could. The issue was the selective nature of that criticism, the way certain people were held to account for every tiny misstep, while others got away with far worse without consequence. Stephen jumped on that point. He said that was exactly why shows like his existed, to call out those inconsistencies, to point out when powerful people were not being held accountable. Michelle's response was swift and cutting. She said that if that was true, then he needed to examine his own show more carefully, because, from where she was sitting, it looked like he spent a lot more time going after certain targets than others. She asked him when was the last time he had pressed one of his favorite guests the way he was pressing her right now. The question clearly stung. Stephen's face flushed slightly, and he shifted in his seat. He said that was not fair, that she was making assumptions about his intentions based on one conversation. Michelle did not back down. She said she was making observations based on years of watching his show, of seeing patterns in who got tough questions and who got softballs, of noticing who was expected to explain themselves and who was simply celebrated. Stephen took a deep breath, visibly trying to maintain his composure. He said that if she had problems with how his show operated, she could have declined to come on. Michelle's laugh was sharp and humorless. She said that was the trap, was it not? If she declined, she would be accused of avoiding difficult conversations. But if she came on and pushed back against unfair treatment, she would be labeled as difficult or overly sensitive. She said there was no winning move, which was precisely the point. The audience was completely silent now. Stephen seemed to recognize that he was in deeper than he had anticipated. He tried a different approach, his tone softening. He said that he genuinely wanted to understand her perspective, that if she felt he had been unfair, he was willing to listen to why. Michelle studied him for a long moment before responding. She said that the problem was not just this one interview. It was the accumulation of thousands of small moments across years of public life where she had been questioned, doubted, and scrutinized in ways that others were not. She talked about being asked to prove her patriotism, to explain her marriage, to defend her children, to justify every single thing she did or said. She said that by the time someone reached her level of exhaustion with it all, a seemingly innocent question could feel like an attack because it was just one more in an endless series. Stephen listened, and for the first time since the confrontation had begun, he seemed genuinely affected by what she was saying. When he finally responded, his voice was quieter, more thoughtful. He said that he could not fully understand her experience, that he recognized his own position of privilege in being able to ask questions without having faced the same level of scrutiny himself. Michelle acknowledged his words with a slight nod, but her expression remained guarded. She said that appreciation was a start, but what really mattered was what came next, whether this conversation would actually change anything or whether they would both go back to business as usual. She said she had been in enough of these moments to know that people often expressed understanding in the heat of the moment, but then nothing fundamentally shifted. Stephen asked what she would want to see change. Michelle did not hesitate. She said she would want to see interviewers do their homework, understand the full context of situations before asking questions, recognize their own biases and blind spots, and most importantly, apply consistent standards across the board. She said if you were going to grill one person about their record, you needed to grill everyone about theirs with the same intensity. She said anything less than that was not journalism. It was just performance. The words hit hard because there was truth in them that was difficult to dismiss. Stephen sat back, processing what she had said. He told her that she had given him a lot to think about, and he meant it sincerely. But then he added that he still believed in the value of asking difficult questions, even if the execution was not always perfect. Michelle agreed that difficult questions were important, but she emphasized the difference between questions that sought to illuminate and questions that sought to trap or embarrass. She gave an example from earlier in their conversation, pointing out how he had framed certain questions in ways that presumed guilt or failure, rather than genuinely exploring complexity. Stephen started to defend his phrasing, but Michelle cut him off. She said he could either listen or he could defend himself, but he could not do both effectively. The audience reacted audibly to her directness. Stephen closed his mouth and gestured for her to continue. Michelle laid out specifically how several of his questions had been structured, breaking down the assumptions embedded in the language he had used. She explained how those subtle word choices shaped the entire dynamic of the conversation, putting her on the defensive before she had even opened her mouth to respond. She said once you saw it, you could not unsee it. It was in almost every interview she did, to varying degrees. Stephen listened intently, and you could see him mentally reviewing his own questions. He admitted that he might not have been as careful with his language as he should have been. Michelle said might was not good enough, that if he was serious about being better, he needed to be honest about when he had fallen short. She said this was not about making him feel bad, it was about acknowledging reality so that actual improvement could happen. The conversation had reached a critical point. Stephen took a moment, then said something that seemed to surprise even himself. He said that maybe the real problem was that shows like his had become so focused on entertainment value that they had lost sight of their responsibility to inform. He said that in the race for ratings and viral clips, nuance had become a casualty, and maybe that was something the entire industry needed to reckon with, himself included. Michelle's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been respect crossing her features. She said that was the first thing he had said all night that felt completely honest. She told him that the entertainment industry, the news industry, the political industry, they had all become so intertwined that it was hard to tell where one ended and another began. She said that people with platforms like his had more power than they wanted to acknowledge, and with that power came a responsibility that could not be waved away with jokes or deflections. Stephen nodded slowly. He said that he got into comedy because he wanted to make people laugh and think, but somewhere along the way those two goals had maybe gotten out of balance. Michelle pressed him on that point. She asked whether making people think was really the goal, or whether it was making people think what he wanted them to think. She said there was a difference between provoking thought and shaping opinion, and too many people in his position confused the two. The audience was transfixed. Stephen seemed to be genuinely grappling with what she was saying, rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. He admitted that he had opinions, strong ones, and that those opinions definitely influenced how he approached his show. But he said he tried to be transparent about that, to let people know where he stood, rather than pretending to be objective. Michelle said transparency was good, but it was not a free pass. She said that when you had millions of viewers, many of whom trusted you to help them make sense of a complicated world, you had an obligation to challenge your own thinking as much as you challenged others. She said she was not asking him to abandon his principles or stop having opinions, but she was asking him to consider whether he was serving his audience or just confirming what they already wanted to believe. That question hung in the air. Stephen looked out at his audience, then back at Michelle. He said that was a fair criticism, one that probably applied to more than just him. Michelle agreed. She said the entire media ecosystem had become tribal, with everyone retreating to their own corners and only talking to people who already agreed with them. She said it was making the country weaker, making people less capable of handling disagreement or complexity. Stephen asked her how she thought things could change when the incentives were all pushing in the opposite direction, when conflict drove clicks and controversy drove ratings. Michelle said that was exactly the kind of question that revealed the problem. She said people kept acting like they had no choice, like they were powerless against market forces or audience demands, but that was a cop-out. She said individuals made choices every single day about what kind of work they wanted to do and what kind of impact they wanted to have. The energy between them had shifted. It was still intense, but there was less defensiveness now, more genuine engagement with difficult ideas. Stephen said that he heard what she was saying. Michelle said that she had spent 8 years in the White House trying to make a difference, and she knew how hard it was to move the needle on anything meaningful. But she also knew that giving up was not an option, that everyone with any kind of influence had to keep pushing, keep trying, keep holding themselves and others to higher standards. Stephen said that sounded exhausting. Michelle laughed, a real laugh this time, and said that he had no idea. She said that was part of why this conversation had gotten so heated, because she was tired, bone tired, of having to explain things that should be obvious, of having to prove herself over and over, of being expected to maintain perfect composure while others got to be messy and complicated and human. She said she was done with that, done with performing, done with making other people comfortable at the expense of her own truth. The audience applauded again, longer and louder this time. Stephen waited for the applause to die down, then said that he appreciated her being willing to speak that truth, even when it made things uncomfortable. Michelle said that was exactly right, that growth only happened when people were willing to be uncomfortable, to question themselves, to sit with uncertainty rather than defaulting to easy answers. As the interview wound down, Stephen asked if she would come back on the show again. Michelle smiled, but it was a complicated smile. She said that depended on whether tonight meant anything or whether it was just good television. She said she would be watching to see what came next, to see whether he took any of this to heart. She said the choice was his, as it always had been. Stephen said that was fair, and that he hoped he would prove worthy of another conversation down the line. The band started playing, signaling the end of the segment. Stephen stood, and after a moment's hesitation, so did Michelle. They shook hands, and the audience could see that, despite everything, there was mutual respect there, even if there was also disagreement and frustration. As Michelle walked off stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below. What do you think? Was Stephen right to push the way he did? Or did Michelle have a valid point about double standards? Let me know in the comments.